Most of us are familiar with the concept of inside and outside the Beltway. It's the concept of inner loop and outer loop that always trips me up. Inside and outside the Beltway become points of demarcation in trying to locate something. I know you're on Route 40, but are you inside or outside the Beltway? But if we're honest with each other, we'd have to admit that the distinction between inside and outside the Beltway is much more than just a way of identifying location. It can also be used to identify the status of different people. So many people tend to think of those who live outside the Beltway as the folks who are affluent, privileged, and successful, while those inside the Beltway are poorer, less educated, and less fortunate. Now, the idea of dividing lines is nothing new. It's been going on for thousands of years. In fact, had there been highways and byways and interstates when Jesus was around, I'm sure that there would have also been beltways. I'm confident that there would have been one right smack in the middle of Israel, above Jerusalem, but below Galilee. It would have been called the Samaritan Beltway, because it would have surrounded the area of Samaria. Now, Samaritans were a mixed breed of Jews. They were the product of the Babylonian exile, which had occurred more than 5 centuries before the time of Jesus. When the Babylonians conquered the Israelites, they exiled most of them to Babylon. But they allowed a small group of Jews to remain in Samaria, Jews who then intermarried with the Babylonians and adopted many of their pagan ways. So Samaritans had both Jewish and pagan blood in them, and they observed both Jewish and pagan customs. As a result, even though they lived right in the middle of Israel, they would have been segregated and isolated from the rest of the Jews in Israel. Most Jews would not have traveled through Samaria. That is, if the Samaritans would have even let them travel through. Remember the gospel reading from a couple weeks ago? Jesus wanted to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem, but the Samaritans wouldn't let him through because he was a Jew and his destination was Jerusalem. The disciples wanted to call down fire from heaven to consume the Samaritans, but Jesus rebuked them and decided to travel around Samaria instead. Had there been cars at the time, they would have taken the Beltway. So when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, he's not trying to explain more than what it means to be a good neighbor, or how to be a good neighbor. He's trying to explain to the Jewish lawyer who is his neighbor. And the response is that the Samaritan is his neighbor. And that idea would have been startling to the lawyer. He would not have regarded a Samaritan as his neighbor. After all, the Samaritans lived inside the Beltway, while the lawyer lived outside. In fact, when Jesus asks the lawyer who the neighbor in the story was, the lawyer can't even bring himself to say the Samaritan. Instead, he says, the one who treated him with mercy. Yet when you think about it, is it all that surprising that the Samaritan was the one who helped the robbed and beaten victim in the story? The Samaritan would have almost certainly known what it felt like to be robbed and beaten. As a member of a despised and segregated group surrounded by a privileged and affluent people, he knew what it was like to be victimized. Unlike the priest and the Levite who passed by the man on the other side of the road, the Samaritan had no trouble identifying with him. He knew that he couldn't depend on the leaders of the privileged majority to help. He knew that if anyone was going to stand up for this beaten and abandoned man, it would have to be someone who shared his lot. You see, it's hard for those who live outside the Beltway to see those who live inside of it as their neighbors. It's hard to expect them to empathize with those inside the Beltway, unless, of course, they themselves once lived there and still remember where they came from. We are in the midst of one of the most unbelievable periods of our history. We have watched with horror the shootings of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge and Philando Castile in Falcon Heights. 2 more black men in a string of black men killed by white cops without any apparent justification. We were still trying to wrap our minds around that when police officers in Dallas were shot and killed by a black man apparently targeting white police officers. We've now added the motto, Blue Lives Matter, to the ongoing cry of Black Lives Matter. And like so many things in our polarized society, there are already those drawing lines, taunting Americans to take sides, as though you can only be either for black men or for white police officers, but you can't be for both. What is happening to our nation? How are we as Christians called to respond to it? And what does the parable of the Good Samaritan have to teach us about it? Well, the Samaritan man can certainly be used as a model for action. Moved with pity by what we see in our world, we are called to act with compassion, to be healers of the brokenness in our world. But that's just a bit too easy to say in a complex world that seems entrenched in the injustices that oppress the minority. It just seems a bit too easy for white people to tell black people to get over it and start healing what's happening on our city's streets, as though African Americans are responsible for the racism in our society. So maybe we need to go back to the original question that Jesus was answering when he told the parable of the Good Samaritan. Not what should I do to love my neighbor, but more fundamentally, and who is my neighbor? Perhaps Jesus is saying to us, before you can decide what you should do for your neighbor, you have to decide who your neighbor is. Because only once you understand who your neighbor is, can you understand the command to love your neighbor as yourself. And according to the parable, the neighbor is the one who can identify with those who are robbed and beaten and left for dead at the side of the road. Let's be honest, folks, you don't need me to tell you that most white people just don't get it. And they probably never will. Not because they are bad people or even just stupid people, any more than the priests and the Levites of Jesus' time were bad or stupid. They were wrong, but they weren't bad or stupid. They were just doing what they thought the law commanded of them. But you see, most white people are part of the privileged class. And like the priests and the Levites, they just don't have the experience that allows them to identify with the one who has beaten down by prejudice, robbed of their dignity, and left for dead on the margins of society. It's just harder, not impossible, but harder for many white folks to see African Americans as their neighbors. So when they confront the ugliness that many African Americans experience, they just don't see it. They just cross over to the other side and walk by. The Good Samaritan, on the other hand, was able to help the victim in the parable because he got it. He could identify with him because the same things had happened to him over and over again. He knew not to walk by the victim or even to blame the victim for the crimes committed against him. And probably most important, the Samaritan understood if the downtrodden are to be helped and healed, they cannot wait for the privileged to do it. The Samaritan had to do it himself. And so at this point in time, I can't say exactly what we need to do in response to the Trayvon Martins, the Michael Browns, the Freddie Grays, and now the Alton Sterlings and Philando Castiles of this country. But I can say one thing with confidence. African Americans cannot wait around for the white majority to fix this problem on their own. Because black folk are the Samaritans who see the problem, who are moved with compassion by it, and who can begin the process to address and heal it, knowing full well that they cannot sit around and wait for those on the other side of the road, for those outside the Beltway to do so. And the horror that police officers are also being shot in our streets does not cancel out the urgency of the race issue at hand. Being horrified by the shooting of young black men and being horrified by the shooting of white police officers are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the same experience that allows African Americans to be Samaritans for murdered black men allows them to be Samaritans for murdered police officers who are taken down in the line of duty. They are both unacceptable situations. And they both cry out for the love of neighbor. And so if St. Bernardine's Church, as a parish, is to be neighbor in these times, especially in this community, then we have to identify with our neighbors and begin the process of healing. We tried to do this about a year ago. Remember our town hall meetings after the riots? We identified 4 priorities for our parish at that time: jobs, parenting, youth, and law enforcement. We had a lot of energy going in, but we ran out of steam pretty fast. Like by September. So we have to return to that effort and start over again, and again, and again, as many times as we may need to in order to be neighbor. And when I say we, I don't just mean me. I need you to step up and help me with this conversation of how St. Bernardines can be neighbor to others. And for us as individuals, we also need to be neighbor in these difficult times. We might begin by just reaching out to someone we know who may be feeling unsafe right now, especially our youth, and talking to them. Or better yet, in the case of our youth, just listening to them. We might approach those in law enforcement, some of whom are in our very own parish family, and encourage and thank them for their service to our community, and let them know that we support them and are praying for them. We can write to our public officials and our local bishops, or participate in peaceful demonstrations, insisting that the church and government address the racism within our institutions. And all of us can begin by falling on our knees and praying. Praying not only for the victims of violence, but also for those who are in danger of becoming victims of violence. Praying for our law enforcement officials who protect us, and our youth who are entrusted to us. And praying for our country, that we might live up to our ideals, especially in these troubled times. There are many things that we could do at this time, but in whatever we do, the most important thing for us is to be clear who our neighbor is, and to ensure that we are neighbor to them. For the command that God enjoins on us today is not too mysterious or remote for us. It's not up in the sky that we should say, who will go up in the sky and get it for us and tell us of it, that we might carry it out. Nor is it across the sea that we should say, who will cross the sea to get it for us and tell us of it, that we might carry it out. No, it is something very near to us, already in our mouths and in our hearts. We have only to carry it out. You see, for many of us who travel, The Beltway is a convenient way to get around. But we cannot be naive in believing that the Beltway is only a physical highway that gets us from one point to another. When the Beltway becomes a point of demarcation for race and wealth and privilege, between those inside the Beltway and those outside, then we have created a Samaria right here in Baltimore. We have to be aware that we continue to segregate people from one another. And we have to be aware how that segregation affects our relationships. We have to be aware that our neighbor is not simply the one who lives within our geographic or socioeconomic vicinity. We have to be aware that our neighbor is not simply the one who looks like us and walks on the same side of the road as us. Our neighbor is the one who identifies with the ills of society and, without waiting for others to do so, treats the beaten and abandoned with mercy. That's how the lawyer defined the neighbor. That's how Jesus defined neighbor. And that's how we must define neighbor, as the one who treats victims with mercy. Now go and do likewise.